Welcome back, seekers of strange history and forgotten logic. Before we dive into tonight's story, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about the Middle Ages. We laugh at the past, at their weird laws, strange punishments, and absurd beliefs. But what if those rules actually made sense? What if the strangest medieval laws, the ones that sound insane to us today, were the only things keeping their world from falling apart? Let's start with one that sounds almost like a joke: the law of bread and water. In medieval England, if a baker was caught cheating customers, using too little flour or too much air, he wasn't simply fined. He was thrown in a cage, dragged through the streets, and forced to eat only his own bread and drink water for days. Cruel? Maybe. But think about this. Bread wasn't just food back then. It was life itself. One bad loaf could spread sickness, cause riots, even starve a village. So when a baker cheated, he wasn't just stealing money. He was risking everyone's survival. The punishment was brutal, but it was also a warning. You mess with bread, you mess with God's work. And here's the twist. That's where we get the phrase, the baker's dozen. To avoid being punished, bakers began adding one extra loaf for every 12 sold, just to prove their honesty. So that weird medieval fear, it's still baked into our language today. Now, what about this one? Don't bathe too much. Yes, in some towns, washing too often could make you suspicious. We think of the Middle Ages as dirty and disease-ridden. But they didn't avoid bathing out of ignorance. They avoided it out of experience. Public bathhouses were popular at first. People met there, relaxed, and even made deals. But soon, they became brothels. And when the Black Death hit, people noticed something terrifying. The cleanest people were dying fastest. They didn't know about bacteria, but they saw the pattern. When you bathed, you opened your pores. When you opened your pores, bad air, miasma, could enter your body. So priests began warning, wash your soul, not your skin. It sounds absurd now, but it saved lives. In a world without science, superstition became survival. Here's another. Don't wear certain colors. In medieval Europe, every color had meaning. Blue was holy, worn by the Virgin Mary. Red was for nobility and warriors. But if a peasant wore purple, that was a crime, punishable by fines or even jail. It sounds ridiculous until you realize what purple meant. It wasn't just a color, it was an economy. Purple dye came from sea snails. Tens of thousands of them, crushed just to color a single robe. Only the richest could afford it: kings, bishops, emperors. So, sumptuary laws, rules about what you could wear, weren't about vanity. They were about keeping society stable. Because when everyone knows their place, no one starts a rebellion. It wasn't fashion control. It was class control. A society built on hierarchy used color as a weapon. Every shade told you who to fear and who to obey. And then there's this strange one, the rule of no night singing. In many medieval cities, it was illegal to sing after sunset. Why? Because night wasn't just darkness, it was danger. Without streetlights, shadows hid thieves and spirits alike. A lone voice in the dark could sound like witchcraft, or worse, an omen. In some towns, if you sang at night and someone fell ill the next day, you could be blamed. But the rule wasn't just fear of magic, it was fear of panic. When people heard voices after dark, they assumed the plague had returned, or that a soul was wandering the streets, unable to rest. So the mayors and bishops made it law: silence after sunset. Not because of religion, but because silence kept the city calm. That's the hidden thread, isn't it? Every insane-sounding law, Every cruel custom was born from chaos trying to survive itself. The medieval world wasn't stupid. It was terrified and practical. When you live surrounded by famine, disease, and war, logic becomes whatever keeps you alive another day. And perhaps the strangest law of all, the rule of the resting pig. In several European towns, if your pig wandered into the street and hurt someone, the pig was put on trial. Yes, a literal trial, with a judge, jury, and sentence. The animal could be found guilty and executed. The reasoning? Divine order. If a pig killed a child, it was possessed. And if no punishment was given, the town believed God would punish them instead. It sounds insane, until you remember what the church had taught. That every act, even an animal's, had spiritual meaning. The trial wasn't about justice. It was about restoring cosmic balance. Every strange medieval rule, every absurd law we laugh at, hid a logic forged in fear, faith, and survival. They weren't trying to be weird. They were trying to make sense of a world that made no sense at all. Love, in the Middle Ages, wasn't romantic. It was regulated. Every touch, every glance, every whispered word between a man and a woman could become a matter of law, sin, or damnation. Because in a world ruled by the church, even your heartbeat could be judged. Let's start with one of the strangest, the rule of unlawful kisses. In medieval France, a kiss wasn't just affection, it was a contract. If you kissed someone in public, it could be considered a binding promise of marriage. Imagine that. One drunken kiss at a feast, and suddenly you're married for life. No priest, no ring, no ceremony, and just lips, witnesses, and fate. That's because in those days, marriage wasn't about love. It was about property, alliances, and purity. And a kiss, especially on the mouth, meant you had shared something sacred: breath, spirit, soul. So, to protect families and reputations, cities began outlawing unholy kisses. Courts kept records of people dragged in front of bishops accused of mouth sin. Some were forced to wed, others paid fines. A few were whipped. It sounds absurd, but for medieval society, order depended on controlling the body. If you control love, you control inheritance. If you control desire, you control loyalty. Then came the rule of the forbidden bed. Married couples were told they must not have sex on Sundays, or on Fridays, or during Lent, or Advent, or on the eve of communion. In fact, if you counted all the holy days, half the year was forbidden for intimacy. So why? Because pleasure was dangerous. The church taught that lust could open the door to demons, that desire, even between husband and wife, could make a soul unclean. And so priests created manuals listing the safe times for marital duty. It was meant to discipline the flesh, but it also revealed how obsessed the system had become with control. There were even rules about positions: what was holy, what was sinful, and which ones could anger the angels. Imagine confessing not just that you sinned, but how. The confessional booth became a kind of medieval surveillance state, where love turned into guilt, and guilt turned into obedience. But not all rules came from the church. Some came from jealousy, fear, and superstition. Take the law of the Virgin's belt. In many noble families, girls were given locked chastity belts before marriage, not because they worked, they didn't, but because they symbolized purity. A woman's body was her father's reputation, and later, her husband's honor. Even suspicion of infidelity could destroy entire dynasties. One wrong glance, one rumor, and a woman could be sent to a convent or executed. Meanwhile, men's sins of the flesh were quietly forgiven or even encouraged. Double standards written in Scripture and sealed in blood. And then there were the rules of the wedding night. In some medieval villages, the newlyweds' first night wasn't private. The community gathered outside their home, singing, shouting, waiting for proof of purity. The bride's family would proudly display the blood-stained sheet the next morning. If there was no stain, the whispers began. If the whispers grew too loud, the woman could be cast out or even tried for deception. In an age obsessed with honor, humiliation was the price of acceptance. But not all strange rules were cruel. Some were unexpectedly tender. In parts of Italy, if a husband hit his wife, he was publicly mocked. The villagers would tie him to a donkey, hang pots around his neck, and march him through town as people threw rotten fruit. It wasn't justice, but it was shame. And shame, in that world, was a weapon stronger than law. The church also had peculiar rules for heartbreak. If someone you loved died, you had to mourn for exactly 1 year, no less. Marrying sooner was considered unchristian. Some widows wore black for the rest of their lives, believing even laughter could offend the dead. The line between devotion and despair was thin, and grief itself became another ritual of control. When you look at all these rules together, kisses that bind, belts that imprison, nights that shame, you see the pattern. Every human feeling, from love to lust to sorrow, was turned into a code, because emotion is chaos. And in a world terrified of chaos, they built laws around it. But the more they tried to cage the heart, the more rebellion grew in secret. In songs, in poems, in whispered letters. It was the birth of courtly love, the idea that true love existed outside the church's authority. That passion itself was divine, not sinful. That God lived not in obedience, but in longing. And it terrified the priests. Because once people began believing love could exist without permission, the entire system began to crack. By the 12th century, love had become dangerous. Not because of war or disease, but because it was awakening something the church feared most: free will. Across Europe, a quiet revolution was unfolding. In the courts of France, Italy, and Spain, poets began to sing of love not as duty, but as destiny. They called it amor cortese, courtly love, and it was heresy wrapped in poetry. Imagine the shock of a bishop hearing a troubadour sing, "That which the priest forbids, the heart makes holy." To love for love's sake was a crime against heaven's hierarchy, because if love could be sacred without permission, then maybe everything could. It began in the south of France, in Aquitaine, Toulouse, and Provence, places far from Rome's iron grip. Here, noble women ruled courts, not as silent wives, but as judges of poetry and passion. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the most powerful woman of her age, gathered knights and poets who celebrated the beauty of longing. They sang of love as something pure, ennobling, transformative, a fire that cleansed the soul rather than damned it. And yet, behind the words, there was defiance. Every poem whispered the same forbidden idea: love is divine because it's human. That was enough to shake the church to its core. Because for centuries, the church had taught that desire was corruption, that women were the root of sin, and pleasure was the devil's trap. But here came poets claiming that a woman's eyes could lead a man not to hell, but to heaven. They spoke of women as muses, not temptresses, of love as grace, not guilt, and of longing as a path to the divine. It wasn't just poetry. It was rebellion disguised as art. Soon, this religion of love began to spread. Knights wrote letters to married ladies they could never touch. Monks secretly copied verses between pages of scripture. Even queens began to defy their arranged marriages in the name of true love. To the church, this was chaos. Love without marriage was sin. Marriage without obedience was scandal. And women with voices were a threat. So they fought back. By the 13th century, bishops started condemning courtly love as spiritual corruption. They declared that desire itself was demonic. Poems were burned, poets exiled, and lovers excommunicated. But ideas have a way of surviving fire. The more the church punished love, the more people romanticized it. Forbidden desire became the ultimate symbol of purity, because anything worth dying for must be sacred. And so, art began to reflect this rebellion. In cathedral windows, once filled only with saints and angels, new faces appeared, knights, kneeling before women, hands clasped not in prayer, but devotion. Painters began to hide love stories within religious scenes, Christ and Mary Magdalene gazing like lovers, angels touching with tenderness that felt almost human. The church didn't notice, or pretended not to, because sometimes beauty disarms better than argument. But not everyone sang of love. Some preached against it loudly. The theologian Bernard of Clairvaux warned that these poets were servants of the flesh. He said their songs would ignite the fires of hell in every heart. And maybe he was right, because in those fires, something new was being born. From those same troubadour songs came a new idea of the human soul, not as property of the church, but as something individual. If love could be chosen freely, then so could faith. If passion could make you feel divine, then maybe holiness wasn't exclusive to priests. That's the real danger courtly love brought. It made people believe in themselves, and it didn't stop with words. Kings began falling for women they weren't supposed to marry. Nuns wrote poems of secret desire. And commoners, hearing those stories, began questioning why they couldn't love as nobles did. The church could burn books, but it couldn't burn feelings. Soon, one of those forbidden romances would explode into scandal, war, and excommunication, a royal affair that blurred the line between sin and salvation, and changed the concept of love forever. It began with a kiss, not in a tavern, not in a song, but in a classroom, between a philosopher and his student. Their names were Abelard and Heloise. He was one of the greatest minds of the 12th century, a scholar of logic, reason, and faith. She was barely 20, but her intellect rivaled his own. When they met, the spark was instant, a meeting of souls in a world that denied women a soul at all. What followed was one of the most passionate, dangerous love stories the Middle Ages ever saw. Abelard was hired to tutor Eloise by her uncle, a powerful canon named Fulbert. At first it was innocent, lessons by candlelight, philosophical debates. But soon, the lessons turned into letters, the letters into touches, and the touches into a love that would shake the foundations of faith itself. Their affair became the talk of Paris, the city's most brilliant theologian, caught in the oldest sin of all. When Eloise became pregnant, Abelard smuggled her to Brittany, where she gave birth to their son, Astrolabe. They married in secret to save her reputation, but the church had no mercy for love that broke its rules. Fulbert saw betrayal, not devotion. He felt shamed, mocked, humiliated. So he did what men in power have always done when love defies them. He destroyed it. One night, his servants broke into Abelard's chamber and castrated him. The philosopher, who had questioned every dogma, was silenced by the most brutal act of obedience. Abelard entered a monastery. Eloise was forced into a convent. And yet, even behind walls of stone, their love refused to die. They began writing letters, long, burning confessions of the heart. Letters so honest, so raw, that even 8 centuries later, they still shock the reader. Eloise wrote, "Men call it sin. I call it truth. In loving you, I learned the nature of my soul." Abelard replied, "What is faith, if not the desire to believe? And what is love, if not the courage to do so without proof?" Their love became a mirror for an entire generation, a story of the mind chained by morality and the heart refusing to kneel. To the church, they were sinners. To history, they were pioneers. Because for the first time, love was written as something equal. A man and a woman, united not by commandment, but by choice. After Abelard's death, Heloise became abbess of the Paraclete, the convent he had built. She never remarried. She never renounced her love. And when she died 20 years later, she was buried beside him. When their tomb was opened, centuries later, their bones were found facing each other, as if still in conversation. But the church learned a different lesson. It realized that love could rival faith, that stories could outlive sermons. So it began rewriting the narrative, turning passion into tragedy, recasting lovers as cautionary tales. The message was clear. Love like theirs was dangerous, because it made people believe in something greater than fear. From that moment on, the church began policing romance more fiercely than ever. Rules about engagement, dowries, chastity, and sin multiplied. Confession manuals started listing sins of the heart. Priests were told to ask married couples about their thoughts, their dreams, their temptations. It wasn't enough to control the body anymore. Now, they wanted the soul's private whisper. But while the church tightened its grip, art, literature, and music spread the opposite message. Troubadours sang of Abelard and Heloise as martyrs of love. Poets in Italy, like Dante, transformed love into a holy force, something that could lift the soul toward God, not away from him. And, from those poems, a new ideal was born, one that would change the world forever. Romantic love. The idea that love could redeem, that love could save, that love could be the meaning of life itself. Yet even as it rose, it remained haunted by its own shadow. Because when something becomes sacred, it can also become sin again. By the dawn of the Renaissance, something extraordinary had happened. The church that once condemned desire was now surrounded by it. In art, in poetry, in music. What began as rebellion had become worship. Love was no longer sin. Love was salvation. Or so it seemed. Painters filled cathedrals with beauty the church could no longer hide. Michelangelo carved bodies that looked divine and human at once. Botticelli painted Venus, naked, serene, emerging from the sea like a goddess reborn. And yet, the church still blessed the canvases. Because if you can't kill beauty, you baptize it. The same power that once burned lovers at the stake now sold tickets to see them in marble. Love had won, but only because it had been tamed. Outside the cathedrals, something darker grew. The new cult of romantic love began to demand its own obedience. Where the church once said, "Obey God," the poets now whispered, "Obey your heart." But the result was eerily familiar. Devotion turned into dependency. Passion became possession. And suffering, once proof of faith, became proof of love. Look at the stories we still tell. Romeo and Juliet, dying to prove they were meant to be. Tristan and Isolde, poisoned by passion. Even the fairy tales that came centuries later. The woman who waits, the man who saves, the love that conquers all. Each one repeats the same old prayer. Love is holy when it hurts. The language changed. The faith didn't. The poets replaced priests. The songs replaced sermons. But the hierarchy stayed the same. Women were still told their worth lay in devotion. Men were still told to conquer hearts like kingdoms. And heartbreak became a kind of holy suffering, a purification of the soul through pain. It's as if humanity, freed from one religion, had built another on the same foundations. Meanwhile, real love, quiet, equal, imperfect, struggled to survive beneath the myth. Because the myth was louder, the myth sold better. Just as the medieval church had sold forgiveness, the modern world began selling romance, roses, rings, vows, promises. Each one another relic of the new faith. We no longer confess to priests. We confess to lovers. And they too demanded absolution. But some remembered the older truth, the one whispered by poets before they were burned. That love isn't about ownership or purity. It's about recognition. It's two souls saying, I see you, not as perfect, but as real. That kind of love doesn't demand sacrifice. It doesn't punish desire. It doesn't fear imperfection. It forgives it. And in forgiving, it becomes divine again. By the 18th century, love had become the language of liberty. Revolutionaries quoted the troubadours as they tore down thrones. Women began to write, to speak, to claim their right to feel. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote that love, when founded on respect, ennobles both sexes. And her words would echo for centuries. The same force that once destroyed kingdoms now built nations. Because people who believe in love, truly believe, are hard to enslave. And yet, the old shadow still lingers, the same one that haunted Abelard and Eloise, the same whisper that said, "If you love freely, you must be punished." Every age finds a new way to disguise control. The church called it sin. The Victorians called it propriety. We call it standards. But love keeps slipping through the cracks. Reborn, redefined, rediscovered. Because you can cage bodies, silence words, burn books, but you can't outlaw the heart. That's the irony of it all. The Middle Ages tried to ban love and failed. The Renaissance tried to sanctify it and lost it. And now, in our own time, we keep trying to monetize it. Yet beneath every rule, every ritual, every heartbreak, there's still that same ancient truth. Love is not obedience. Love is awareness. So, when you hear an old song, read a forgotten poem, or touch someone's hand and feel something timeless, remember this. You're taking part in the oldest rebellion on earth, the one that began in a candlelit room between a philosopher and his student, the one that made poets risk their lives to write, the one that defied kings, popes, and heaven itself, the rebellion called love.